Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll kick off if everyone is ready. You're all very welcome here this evening to our April evening lecture from the Energy and Environment Division. The webcast, this lecture is being webcast, so I'd like to welcome anyone who's online also. And this evening's lecture is entitled "The Development of a New Transport Strategy for the Greater Dublin Area 2015 to 2040. So the presentation will give an overview of the Irish Academy of Engineers submission to the NTA on the development of a transport strategy for the Greater Dublin Area in that period. The submission incorporated a series of project proposals developed to reduce energy consumption and CO2 emissions and minimise congestion on the M50. So I think it'll be a very topical and interesting lecture. Our speaker this evening then to deliver the lecture is Gerry Duggan, who is a very well-known member of the Institute here and the Energy and Environment Division. Gerry is a fellow of the Academy of Engineers and a fellow of the Institute of Engineers also, I believe. And he is the Academy's policy advisor on energy emissions and transport. So Gerry has had a 35-year career. He worked for many years in ESB in very diverse positions, including responsibility for coal and shipping contracts for Moneypoint, and he was the acting as ESB's nominee director on the boards of private companies. So he was a member of the Lewis Advisory and Action Group and a board member of CIE, and has done a lot of work on energy policy here, both with the Institute of Engineers and the Academy of Engineers. So without further ado, hand over to you, Gerry.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, for those not familiar with the Academy, it's a collection of has-beens who have the time and the experience to write policy papers uncontaminated by commercial interests. Effectively, the disclaimers here are that the IEA reports and submissions do draw on expert advice from relevant sectors and agencies, and that includes this evening's presentation, but they reflect the opinions of the authors and not necessarily those of the contributors. So to any of my fellow authors here, thank you for your contributions. As the Chair pointed out, what we tried to do in our submission to National Transport Authority was to recognise that if Dublin is to develop, we need two key things: affordable housing and acceptable travel times. Equally well, in incorporating and developing those proposals, we need to reduce energy consumption and CO2 emissions as a national objective, and indeed even GDA, and we have a very serious problem of building up on the M50 of congestion, which is affecting people, many of them on a daily basis. Key issues. Ireland is almost unique in the EU. Of the 281 regions in the EU, Ireland has the fastest growing population and the lowest is projected to have the lowest age dependency ratio by 2030. Indeed, the EU is projecting that Germany and Italy, that 30% of their population will be in old age dependency by 2030. In Ireland, the figure is only half of that. What that means in practical terms is there are going to be more, the rate of growth of people who are economically active, i.e. who need transportation on a daily basis, is growing. Create particular problems in Dublin. The legacy of the Wide Streets Commission, a very effective, influential body, established 1757, dissolved 1851, but made a major contribution to Dublin. And we have the looming congestion on the N50. And these are occurring at a time when our investment in inland transport in Ireland at 0.45% of GDP is only half of what it is across the OECD countries, and is even more below those with rapidly growing populations. If we look at the Wide Streets Commission, as we said, it did an enormous amount of work. It shows here the kind of main areas that it was active in the city, as well as the North and South Circular Road. But what the Wide Streets Commission didn't do is provide any major north-south access routes in Dublin. And this is significant to today because it limits the ability of buses to provide a solution to the problem. If we look at the M50, these are the peak hour traffic counts on the M1 and the M50 southbound. That's the section going towards the Port Tunnel. And you can see that even at peak hours, cross-border traffic is relatively modest. By the time you get to the Swords interchange, very different story. At the M50 interchange. Then at the same time, a sharp drop-off in traffic going in towards the city, going in towards Whitehall. And the reason of this, of course, is there is a very large number of people turning right, coming down from the M1 and going around the M50 to get to other places of work. Traffic in that area on the Santry end picks up later in the day, and indeed it's no surprise that nearly every morning the AA traffic report leads with congestion at Whitehall Church, and that's what's happening there. But if we look within those figures, and you can see car, LGV, bus and HGV there, if we try to translate that into a car equivalence, and what we've done here is assumed that each HGV is equivalent to 5 cars in terms of the space it takes up. Each bus reduces the car demand by about 40. And you can see that there on the M1, buses make a significant contribution to reducing traffic demand, and are far more significant in terms of their reduction compared with, say, even the HGV traffic there. If we now look at the M50 itself, going around, very constant level of traffic around from the M1 out as far as Dundrum. And indeed, on the busiest section of the M50 there, on the N7, there are about 7,000 people per hour going southbound at that time of the day, if you assume 1.2 people per car. After Dundrum, the traffic levels fall off very sharply. But if you now go to car equivalents, obviously, you know, with the port there, you have a very large HGV contribution. But what's really noticeable in comparison with the M1 is that buses are making absolutely no contribution to meeting the traffic requirements on the M50. And this is, okay, in part, it's difficult to arrange, but with a crisis coming up there, the fastest thing we can do is look at how we can get public transport to operate on the M50, because there are a whole pile of people who are having to go around to Sandyford or that for employment. They have no option but to go around that way, and they have no alternative but to take the car at present. Now, we equally believe that with the information systems now available and the apps, that ride sharing could play a significant role in reducing congestion in the short term. And there are regulatory barriers to that actually happening if somebody is offering to do it and taking a contribution. So we need, as a matter of urgency, to address all issues which can reduce congestion. So immediately implement low-cost solutions now within the city rather than the M50, facilitate walking and cycling. These are the ways that have least use of road for the number of people. And indeed, it's noticeable that in the UK, a number of corporates have come together from the AA to National Grid and said, we need to be spending 5% of our inland transport capital expenditure on improving cycleways, etc., to make them safe, to make the better access. And it is recognising that cycling and walking are not alone just environmentally desirable, but they reduce the volume of traffic. Integration of public transport, and significant improvements have been made, I must say, by the NTA in that area over the years. As I said, bus use on the M50 and ride sharing, and I'll come back to this, expand commuter rail services, Dockland Station, M3 Parkway and Hazel Arch, but I'll come back to there. Now, there are essential road developments, and the first one is to protect the M50's strategic capacity. This is not just about passenger cars on it, which you saw as being very large. The M50 is critical for the commercial life of this country, and we have to protect it as a viable transport route. And as you will have seen from the relatively low volumes of traffic going around, say, at the cross-border back on the M1, we would suggest that the solution is not building an M100 from Drogheda around to Newbridge. It is to ensure that we reduce passenger traffic on the M50. We need to construct a new bridge downstream of the Eastlink Bridge to provide adequate access into the otherwise essentially landlocked South Docks area. Now, the South Docks area is not technically landlocked, but the road infrastructure in the area is not capable of carrying significant traffic. And if that's done, it would be possible then to bring the Lewis Red Line over the existing bridge and down into the Docklands area, which could be developed for commercial and residential development, as well as for port operations. And we need to upgrade the N7 to NACE to motorway standards. But the work there is actually not so much on the N7 itself, it's on the adjoining roads. Now, there are other potentially low-cost or relatively low-cost solutions. What we're suggesting is the development, and indeed I've spoken about this here before, of the currently unutilised oil import facilities at Poolbeg as Dublin's oil terminal, with pipeline connections to Dublin Airport for jet fuel and to the N7 for petrol, diesel, kerosene and gas oil. Now, John Fingleton, who's here this evening, advises that planning permission has been placed or will be placed very soon for the pipeline to the airport. To the N7, we're talking about a multi-product pipeline, so that one pipeline, you have sequential dispatching of the different products. And that would, in John Fingleton's view, be routed along the Grand Canal, out as far as Kishog, which is, I'll come to later, and then down the R136, or Greater Road, to Baldonnel. And the day tanks and the oil tanker loading racks necessary for that would be located down by Baldonnel Airport. So effectively, we would take 3 million tonnes of petroleum products out of the port access tunnel, which is a significant safety benefit, and off the M50. Equally well, we could develop Kishog as an inland rail freight port. I'll come back to that. So if we look at Dublin Port, and if you look at the North Docks area, all the white things you can see there by and large are oil storage facilities, a whole scatter of them, covering 25 hectares. If we look at the south side, you have the much larger unused storage facilities in Poolbeg. These were designed for heavy fuel oil. There are some smaller gas oil tanks to the side. And effectively, with Poolbeg now operating on natural gas and the original steam station with its chimneys closed, these tanks are available, and the berths you see there is capable of carrying significantly larger vessels than are capable of going into the Northport area. And while these tanks were designed for heavy fuel oil, they are suitable for diesel, kerosene, gas oil. They're not, however, suitable for petrol. It has a different requirement. But the bund area you see there, here, is adequate to actually allow the construction of the additional storage tanks that would be necessary to provide or to accommodate petrol. And if you use that facility, as Whitegate Refinery is now used to supply all of the distribution in the south of the country, you can actually improve the strategic storage in Dublin, because it's a fact that, going back, many of those oil tanks you see there are, because of working capital requirements, are operated close to bottom by the operators. So effectively, there is very little strategic storage in Dublin at the moment, other than what is provided or is used by by the National Oil Reserves Agency in Ringsend, and that's not very well connected. So effectively, we could improve the strategic security of supply in Dublin. We could take 25 hectares or make 25 hectares of land available in the North Port, and we could have a lower transport cost and much less emissions. But there are other things we can do in the port area. If you look at it, you have a whole pile of containers sitting there. Now, frankly, that is an appalling use of very valuable real estate. And that's true on the north side, it's true on the south side. And the Dublin Port are well aware of that and want to change that situation. So what we're suggesting is that we develop an inland rail-fed port in Kishog. Now, Kishog is on the Kildare line between Clondalkin and Adamstown. Those of you who know it passing it in the train will note the number of piebalds and skewbald horses that are running around there. It is land that is currently undeveloped but zoned residential, approximately 65 hectares. And it is one of the 3 large land tranches in Dublin identified in Department of Environment reports as having the potential for housing. The reality is Kishog is the last place in Dublin we should be developing housing in. Adamstown has a whole pile of well-developed infrastructure. Clongriffin, that area on the north side, equally well-developed infrastructure. We need to keep containers in the sticks and people in the city rather than the other way around. Now, that site is served by the R136 Graincastle Road, connecting the N4 to the N81. And 30% of the total traffic volumes going to or from Dublin Port are going into that quadrant from about between the M50 almost, or going back a bit to slightly further in, and 20 miles out from the M50. So a very significant portion of Dublin's traffic is directed, or Dublin Port's traffic is either for that area or from that area. Now, an inland port at that location could receive loaded containers from Dublin Port by rail. It would distribute those containers by road to logistics and warehousing centres between the N3 and the N81. Receive and store and repair empty containers. So all those empty containers you saw littered around the docklands could be out there rather than occupying valuable real estate. And there is a requirement for empty containers in the south of the country so that we can export agricultural products. And with the end of milk quotas today, everyone is conscious that the volume of those exports are going to increase. And 2 of the major processing plants that have been developed, Bellevue and Mallow, are immediately adjoining the rail network. Finally, while some of those containers may be shipped out from Cork or Waterford, because of the wider range of low-low destinations served by Dublin, there is also a requirement to bring loaded containers back from the south and west to Dublin Port. And if we look at how the road network in the Kishog area could be developed, this is an existing road here from the N3 down. And we're talking about a dual carriageway road now. Fingal County Council planned to bring that road down as far as the Liffey. South Dublin County Council planned to bring it down further and down into this area. But what we're saying in the context of an inland port at Kishog is bring it this way, along here, and connect up with the Grange Castle Road down to the N81. And effectively, the land along there is very low value because you've a double circuit 220 kV line running along it. So effectively, a lot of it is already sterilised. The other advantage of that is, I spoke earlier about the oil terminal at Baldown. That's located there. So oil tankers could use that road for distribution throughout the country. And thirdly, as well as serving Kishog, container terminal, the oil terminal, it is a parallel route to the most heavily congested part of the M50. And indeed, in terms of what can be done to relieve congestion, there are other proposals that have been developed by the NRA and the local authorities for similar kind of slip roads that could relieve congestion. And those need to be considered. But there are limits to road network capacity. All the measures identified above will not provide the transport capacity to meet projected needs of our rapidly growing population and the projected increase in HGV traffic to and from Dublin Port. And I suggest there's very little scope for expanding road capacity. I indicated that an M100 really wouldn't make an awful lot of contribution. We also believe that the proposed southeast motorway from Dublin Port, if you think about it, the M50 at its peak, 4 lanes, is carrying 7,000 passengers per hour. That would be a 2-lane tunnel. You know, you're talking about, at best, 4,000 passengers per hour. In terms of the cost involved, we suggest that there are much better alternatives, and we'll come to that. And we have to be conscious of the need to reduce CO2 emissions. We can't just keep planning for more road capacity. There are constraints on what we can do. Thus, we suggest that the adoption of an integrated rail-based high-capacity commuting solutions, which is the norm in other European countries with medieval cities, is essential. Now, what's important if we're talking about government planning anything is that there are clearly set out guidelines by which infrastructure expenditure is undertaken. We suggest, firstly, policy has to be to maximise the use of existing assets, determine the sequence of development on clear commercial grounds. I think all of us who are involved in the area or have been involved in the area are aware that when the government is funding, political pressures can come to bear and you get, shall we say, suboptimal returns. We need to publish clear and transparent investment guidelines. And we need to develop a small number of projects properly at any time, and particularly remember the lessons of the M50. The original M50 was built on a shoestring, and it had to be re-engineered and rebuilt at very much higher cost than it would have taken to build it properly in the first place. So what we're saying is, don't try come up with solutions that may appear a sticking plaster solution. Have a clear vision of where you're going and adopt those. Also, ensure that proposed developments are fully integrated. This may seem, obvious, but it hasn't happened in the past. And where possible, to break projects, major projects, into stages where the individual stages can be developed separately and contribute to the overall solution. Because very large, complex projects have a much greater chance of going wrong. And we have to ensure timely land use planning is implemented. And this was very successfully done at Dublin Airport in terms of runway development. Given the history of planning in North County Dublin or County Dublin, it is quite extraordinary that Dublin Airport, which is only 10 kilometres from the city centre, can plan a new runway with virtually no house acquisition. In Heathrow, the third northwest runway will require the acquisition of between 700 houses, according to the airport company proposing it, or 4,000 houses, according to local politicians. And that is, of course, the reason why Dublin is now viewed by British Airways and others as the third Heathrow runway, serving the whole of the north of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And effectively, we need that type of thing was possible because of good long-term planning. We need to do the same in terms of rail infrastructure. We need to have a long-term vision of where we're going and execute it. And we suggest, from what we'll show you later, that there are key sites that need to be effectively identified now and sterilised now, otherwise very desirable future development possible. Now, if we look at the rail network in Dublin in 2015, and these lines, the thickness of them, are reasonably representative of the peak hour capacity of each of the systems. So the existing Lewis lines have a capacity of about 5,000 passengers per hour per direction. And as you can see through Connolly there, it's higher, it's closer to 10,000 at the moment. But effectively, there is very little integration in the rail system in Dublin. And indeed, most of the integration arises because of the construction of the rather ugly loop line from Connolly to Pearse in 1891. And that was undertaken not for passengers, but to speed the transfer of mails between Britain and Ireland, and indeed between the US and Britain, where the mails were brought up from Queenstown and across the Irish Sea. But we have a distinct lack of interconnection. The other element that was done there more 100 years later, or more than 100 years later, was the Lewis line from Euston to Connolly. But what can we do? How can we maximise the use of existing assets? How can we integrate the system? Well, now let's look at what will be done by 2020. Firstly, you have the Lewis Cross City going from Stephen's Green to Broome Bridge, and that's under construction at the moment and will be delivered by 2020. But that brings its own problems, because two things. The existing Lewis line between Sandyford and Stephen's Green is operating at capacity between 8:45 in the morning and 9:15, and I see heads shaking here, but having said that, that is what the operators have said to us. Equally well, the extension to Bride's Glen at the moment goes through a scene of kind of commercial wilderness, but that is going to develop. And effectively, between this element and that element there, the passenger numbers on this are going to increase significantly in the period. What we're suggesting is that that section of line be upgraded to metro standard by 2020. And that's effectively to provide for 80-metre long trams rather than the existing 40-metre long trams. Now, what's required there is just the extension of platforms at 13 stops and an upgrading of electrical and other systems. The requirement to do that is far easier and simpler than the requirement or what was involved in the 8-car DART programme, because that involved the extension of platforms at 30 stations, high-level platforms, and the associated upgrade. Now, there is the other issue that the on-street section from Broome Bridge to Stephen's Green will probably not be able to operate with the same headways as are achievable on effectively the predominantly segregated section from Sandyford to Stephen's Green. And thus there will be a significant number of trams will have to be turned back at Stephen's Green. Otherwise the whole city may tend to come to a halt. What we're suggesting is that 80-metre trams which are turned back at Stephen's Green be interleaved with the other services running from Bride's Glen to Broome Bridge. And that would give you probably about a 25% of increase in system capacity at relatively low cost. The other element that will happen by 2020 is, and people say, Erin Road Erin don't realise the Phoenix Park tunnel exists. The answer is they actually do. But the reason it isn't used is you have a capacity constraint on this section here. So effectively between the Maynooth line and between the Northern and the Dart, you can't actually get more trains through there at the moment. So having a connection through the Phoenix Park tunnel is of no use because you're not going to get anywhere, or at least to where people want to go to a certain extent. Now, part of the current programme to 2020 is that the signalling on that section of line is being upgraded from 12 pots per hour to 16 pots per hour. So that will allow an increase in capacity. And the other thing, and those of you who use the DART will be aware, there's a turn-back facility being provided at Grand Canal Dock. And the reason for that is because of the level crossings on this section of line, it can't operate at the same frequency as is possible on the segregation up here. So effectively, with a turn-back situation, you can increase the frequency of trains between Connolly there and Grand Canal Dock by 25% and accommodate services coming via the Phoenix Park Tunnel down into that area. Now, what's possible by 2025? Well, the most significant development we think is feasible is this: to complete the four-tracking of the Kildare line from Ballyfermot through to Euston Station. This is only 3 kilometres of line. There's 3 tracks in some places, 2 in others. And if you do that, we suggest it's possible to take 2 kilometres off the projected length of the Dart interconnector. I'll come back to that in a second. But if you four-track from here to here, you can now run up to 6 services per hour down to Dockland Station there. And the Dockland Station, though not much used at the moment, is actually by far and away the best located station in terms of the all IFSC, though it's no longer IFSC, and North and South Docks area. In fact, more of that area is within 1 kilometre of Dockland Station than is within 1 kilometre of Connolly, Pearse, as Connolly, Torres Street, Pearse and Grand Canal Dock combined. So we believe that with the development in that area, that would provide a significant capacity to get people from here into there. And an important thing about that is it's giving people access to lower cost housing. Because while an awful lot of people working in Google land at the moment may be young and single, they're presumably not going to stay that way all the time. And family obligations are going to force them to seek accommodation suitable for families. And there's very little accommodation in the Dublin area that's either affordable or suitable for families. So we need to look how we can get these people, how we can keep them in employment in the area by giving them access to lower cost housing at acceptable travel times. Other developments in that period, Clongriffin to the airport. The existing station at Clongriffin was designed to accommodate an extension to the airport. And that route is virtually under the flight path the whole way. There are, well, when I last looked at it, there were 14 landowners only along the total length of it. And with an elevated station at Dublin Airport, that would allow people, all of this area, to access Dublin Airport. We suggest that, and indeed this is consistent with what Ian Rodern have said, that initially that service might be operated by a DMU service from, say, Grand Canal Dock or even an intercity rail car if we want to be swanky. But it would allow access to the airport from that side at relatively low cost. The final element, the RPA are anxious to develop from Blackhorse here on the Red Line out to Lucan to serve, there's nearly 40,000 people living in that area in Lucan. So it's a significant traffic problem. However, there are issues, at least as we see it, in that if you do that, you will, in the inner area, run into the same congestion problems that are being experienced here at the moment. A possible relief is that associated with the Kildare Line 4 tracking, an interchange is provided there at Kylemore, so that people who are destined for that area, rather than continuing fairly slowly through the city on the Luas, could transfer to a much faster service there. But in developing that line, we need to be cognizant of capacity issues. Turning to 2030 now, and this is where we see the big changes occurring, and really quite profound. By 2030, it's possible to have an integrated rail network in Dublin. And this is associated with the planned DART interconnector. You will be familiar that the DART interconnector is planned to run from Docklands there through as far as Houston, or indeed, as Ian Rodern more recently proposed, as far as Inchicore. And that may appear to be not that significant, but what it does is allows you to separate the DART network coming from the north there through to here from the network coming from Maynooth over and down to Bray. And a significant point here is that the rolling stock currently used on the DART system is not fire rated for long tunnel operation. It was bought that way, but the changing regulations means it's no longer compatible. So effectively you have the rolling stock, or with the development you would have rolling stock available to provide that route. And now you're looking at something that looks like a normal city transport pattern. The other thing, on that, we suggest that that line down to here be electrified at 25 kV rather than the existing 1500 volts for the DART system. And the reason for that is 25 kV is becoming internationally recognised as the standard voltage for certainly any longer term railways. And we would envisage that even at the initial development, it would extend from Drogheda through as far as Hazelhatch. And one of the benefits of doing that is that there is an existing excellent maintenance facility in Drogheda which was designed to allow for maintenance of electric rolling stock, and that would avoid the need for a new maintenance facility. Equally well, it provides you with a significant leg on the way to Belfast, and the Northern Ireland authorities now believe that the electrification of the Belfast line is the desirable next stage after the existing enterprise rolling stock reaches the end of life. This is in part coloured by the fact, I suspect, that in the UK, electrification stagnated for a very long time. But now they have adopted a sudden programme of electrifying on quite a large scale. And I saw in the recent budget, there was even suggestions that the Selby to Hull rail line be electrified. Now that's carrying 1 train per hour. So the thinking has moved on. And the great benefit of the Belfast line, or there are 2 great benefits, or 3. One is that you would have commuting traffic at each end, and that would take up, nearly 30 miles or 60 miles of the electrification. The second is the bridges on the section between Dublin and Dundalk were all raised to accommodate 9'6" containers, and therefore can take 25 kV electrification. So those are significant benefits. Now, equally well, the Lewis people aren't sitting on their hands, and they have initiated a consultation process at the moment to extend from Broombridge to the northwest city. Broombridge is perhaps not the most desirable place to finish up at the moment, so I can see the rationale for that. So this represents a very significant advance in what's possible. But equally well, there is a question hanging out there, and that's Swords. Swords is actually the largest town in Ireland that doesn't have a rail connection. It's 40,000 people, and a very large number of them work at the airport. In fact, Swords has the highest proportion of people reported as working in the transportation sector in the 2011 census of any town in the country. And we believe, and we will indicate in some graphics or some pictures here this evening, that a first stage of the development of a metro would be the extension or the development of it from Swords down as far as Drumcondra, where you would have a potential interchange with the upgraded rail line here, except it would involve about a 250-metre walk. Not too dissimilar to what you'll find in some of the underground stations in London and Paris. And effectively, that could be delivered as phase 1. So separating out the projects and breaking them up as far as possible. Now, if we go on to 2035, what we now envisage is the completion of that metro line from Drumcondra down as far as Ranelagh, so that you have a completely segregated rail line from Swords down as far as Ranelagh, and there are just 2 road junctions between there and Sandyford. So effectively, you're looking at a segregated, fully segregated, high capacity metro system from there to there. Now, when I say high capacity, it's not high capacity in the sense of Hong Kong, Paris or London. You're talking about 20,000 passengers per hour per direction rather than 80,000 passengers per hour per direction. We just don't have the population density in Ireland to justify the kind of full metro scale developments. But you are talking about a significant thing, and what that's now giving you is it's giving you the missing critical cross-city interconnection that, as I said, the Broad Streets Commission didn't give, and you now have the ability to effectively get through all quadrants of the city with one interchange. And finally, if we go to 2040, Building on what's being done there, we now envisage the rail line to Belfast being electrified fully, and enterprise trains running from Belfast through as far as Houston to give you a fully integrated thing and running on to turn back at Inchicore. Equally well, we would envisage that the airport to Clongriffin be electrified at the same stage or possibly even earlier. Now, one advantage of that is it's frequently complained of that the service frequency on Belfast-Dublin is not appropriate for the two largest cities in the country. And the problem is the rail network north of Connolly, or north of Clontarf, is only twin track, and it's not possible to increase it. It's not possible to four track it at this stage. And if you put more non-stop Belfast services on it, it eats up capacity on the suburban rail network. But what this would allow you to do is that every second train from Belfast could terminate at Dublin Airport, because Dublin has now become a recognised regional hub in airport terms. So this would improve Belfast's accessibility to the rest of the world, and it would allow you to have increased frequency with an interchange there at Clongriffin. Equally well, once you do this and run continuously through Stephen's Green, you're no longer running on street from Stephen's Green through to Harcourt Street, etc. And that would allow you to develop down to the southwest city. Now, we recognise that there are difficulties in getting any sort of reservation through to that part of the city. The road network is not very helpful. It would be quite a long-term project in terms of acquisition of housing, etc., but one that we think has to be considered in the longer term. Equally well, there are plans to develop the Lewis network from Bride's Graham, but again, you need the capacity here before you can realistically think about that. So that effectively is how we see an integrated rail network developing in Dublin, and these plans are broadly similar to the ones that have been articulated to date, with the exception, as I said, that we would envisage overground running rather than underground running between Houston and Inchicore. But our proposals in relation to Swords to Sandyford are materially different from those that have been discussed to date in the so-called Metro North, which terminated at Stephen's Green. And let's look at whether it's actually physically possible to do that and have a segregated alignment and minimal tunnelling, or certainly minimal bore tunnelling. So if we look, what we're saying is you start at Ranelagh Station, where the Harcourt Street line effectively ends up. And from this point, you start reducing the level of the road there, so that the rail line, instead of continuing on at level, virtually horizontally, drops down at effectively 6% on the whole way inwards. Continuing along that alignment there, you're still dropping down. Now at this point here, you begin to deviate off the existing road and going through those two houses there. Sorry. Yep. Across this road, under this road, in fact, at this point, because you've dropped down so much, because there's a requirement to drop the levels quite significantly. And through this area here. Now, Michael Fingleton may not have left the city many positive legacies, or indeed the country. But one thing he did was he didn't develop the site at the back of his old Irish Nationwide Building Society headquarters. And effectively, you have a large area there which we envisage as being the ideal place where a bored tunnel could come up to your cut and cover portal, and you could have reasonable construction activity there. That's looking at it from another site. Now, that particular site was bought last year by London and Regional Development Company for 13 million. But the same company flipped the Four Seasons Hotel recently. They'll take a profit. They won't be slow about asking for it. But equally well, their performance to date in Dublin indicates that they are quite prepared to flip properties. If we now look at the northern end and we think, And what we've said is we need to actually develop a network which is lower cost than the solutions that have been put forward to date. So rather than starting at Hampstead Park, which is where the port access, or where the Metro North was to start in terms of tunnel boring, we believe that the sensible place to start is Clonliffe College grounds here, Holy Cross College, Clonliffe. You have a large area there, as you can see, relatively little used. And we believe that tunnel boring machines could start here. And this is actually virtually behind the Archbishop's house. And in talking to the Archbishop, he didn't raise any objections. He was actually much more concerned about the Lewis line running outside his Pro Cathedral. And he'd certainly take the money because the reality is he needs money that doesn't appear on the church plate for various reasons that I won't go into. So effectively, we believe there is an excellent site there to develop port access tunnel, and you would launch your tunnel boring machines from that site. From there, across the Tolka, and this is Tolka Park. Dublin City Council plan to redevelop that park for housing. And they're in the process of buying Dalymount Park, where Shelburne and Bohemians would play. And they've demanded as a condition that they are the ground landlords there, they own the lease, but that Tolka Park be returned to them as part of that deal. And that seems to be in a fairly late stage of completion. Going across the park, elevated, a stop over Richmond Road there. So that redevelopment there would have a stop immediately next to it. And across the green area shown here. Now you can't see it from here, but the ground actually rises quite steeply at that point. So you're talking about going in under here, demolishing the 100-year-old Church of Ireland school there and rebuilding it on the adjoining green area, and into All Hallows, which DCU are in the process of acquiring. Cut and cover through a portion of it, coming up to the back end there, in here. This is the Carmelite convent, but the Carmelite nuns have moved to Malahide, and effectively that's now a property play. Under Griffith Avenue, with a stop on the south side there in a cutting. Under those houses, which clearly have to go. Out there, back garden. Unfortunately, through that row of houses there. It's unfortunate, but it's almost, there was an apartment development built at the back of it there, which precludes using that alignment. Through that gap there, into the back of the Regency Hotel, where again the owners are quite happy to take the money. Out the back there, as you can see, a highly developed site at the moment, running between these buildings here and Highfield Hospital. Now, I haven't spoken to the Eustaces, but they have recently built extensions to the hospital which get quite close to the boundary there, but there is still space to get through. And this is, Tim Brick will be very familiar with this. This is Collins Avenue, this is the site where the port access tunnel boring machine was launched from. As you can see, it's quite a mess. So if you're launching a tunnel boring machine, you need a site reasonably remote from humankind if you can manage it. And as I said, the Clonliffe College site seems to fit that very well. Again, this is the area in Whitehall after or at the time of the port access tunnel being built, but you're talking about going along at elevated level along there in front of the church. And again, the Archbishop has no objections. Please put money on the plate. Along the side here, this area has been reinstated since the port tunnel works was done, but you can see the alignment. Under Shantallan Road, which is back here, with a stop there in a cutting. And then along the side of where the M1 or the M50 originally was before it was put into a tunnel. And you have a long area there which you'll be quite familiar with. Now if we go on from there, that green area ends up on a wall there at the back of this. Now effectively you're talking about coming inside that wall there, and this is a large site which is owned by Dublin City and which again they're planning to develop for housing. And again you would be talking about a stop there servicing that development and the other adjoining houses. Across the throat of the port access tunnel, along by trees there at the Santry roundabout, across going towards Morton Stadium there, elevated, down into Santry Domain, elevated with a stop in that area as well, and then running in cut and cover through Santry Domain, and eventually coming up to ground at here. This is Northwood Road there. That bridge would obviously have to be raised, but effectively running through there and out that gap to the airport, and you can see the plane there. So effectively all of that is feasible at the moment. It would not be feasible in a few years' time because of the developments being proposed. And this is the kind of density of development at Northwood there. And this is the kind of density of development that we believe appropriate on the sites that we were looking at on the way through. So this proposal would actually allow a much higher level of development than is possibly envisaged at the moment. Now if we look at it and if we compare it with the original Metro North proposals, this is Metro North here, and these were the stations as planned. And this is the alternative alignment we are proposing. Now, North Dublin has one benefit. It has a very good orbital road network. And we believe if you're putting in a high capacity system, which is obviously a high capital cost with tunnelling involved, you have to totally change the way the buses operate and effectively adopt what is the norm on the continent, where you have rail systems and bus systems. And that is a herringbone feeding system. So the buses are travelling along there, feeding the higher capacity rail system. And you can see how well connected the alignment we have proposed is with the road system, compared with the Metro North proposals. Equally well, it picks up not just DCU. I accept that it's 500 metres further from the centre of DCU than that stop there. But I believe college students are capable of walking 500 metres. It won't come as too much of a strain to them. You have Beaumont Hospital there, which is a very serious traffic congestion point. And effectively, as the hospital is developed, the parking spaces on it are eliminated. So this is an issue for staff as everything else. The management of Beaumont Hospital have said to us that there are 20,000 people a day go through the doors there. So that's the kind of level of traffic you have. It's not the number of patients you have, that's the level of traffic. Equally well, there's the old IDA industrial site at Clonshaugh, which doesn't have the same number of employees now that it used to have, but it's still quite a large, significant site. So you're picking up a lot of potential traffic. And as we said, a key in this kind of thing is if you put in a high capacity system, you have to be conscious of how you're going to generate the traffic. So the proposed Swords-Sandyford Metro would provide a high capacity link from the airport, city and South County. It would solve the Swords commuting problem, connect many airport workers to the airport, because it's not just from Swords. That whole alignment down to Whitehall, Drumcondra is traditionally where airport workers live. Serve the whole North City population from the N2 to Malahide Road, 120,000 people, with the bus feeder services we're talking about, and facilitate, as I said, higher density development on the undeveloped sites. It would resolve the Lewis Green Line capacity problem and facilitate extensions of the Lewis system. Significantly reduce car traffic on the M50 and the M1. And this is particularly true if you look at the morning traffic. It is very much a higher level of traffic from Swords over towards Sandyford. People are going around the city for employment in Sandyford. What we're offering is a way through the city so that you're taking the traffic off the M50. And it would significantly reduce CO2 emissions. Now, it would require the acquisition and demolition of 12 houses, but 9 houses had to be acquired for the development of the Lewis Red Line. And you will have seen proposals for the construction of an outer relief road in Galway, which involved the acquisition of between 40 and 130 houses for a road system that would deliver only 5,000 passengers per hour capacity, i.e. a quarter of what we're talking about here. Okay, there's impairment in value of some other houses, some other minor things. But the key thing, all the above proposals are desirable and deliverable, but are they affordable? No point if you can't afford it. And if we look, GDP in 2014 is estimated at 181 billion. Now, it's recognised that GDP in Ireland overstates real economic performance. So we'll use GNP, which is only 85% of the GDP figure, as our marker. And if GDP grew at an estimated 2% per annum, GNP grew at an estimated 2% per annum, the cumulative GNP in the period 2020 to 2040 is actually 4.2 billion, quite a substantial sum of money. Now, if we assume that inland investment in inland transport in Ireland is 0.9%, just in line with the OECD average, that's giving you 37.5 billion for inland transport investment in that period 2020 to 2040. And okay, allocate it on the basis of population. 45% of the population in the country live in the GDA, Louth and Laois, which are the areas we're targeting for service. So if you take that, we're saying there should be 17 billion available for investment in inland transport in that area in the period 2020 to 2040. Will the projects fit within that envelope? Okay, these are the estimated capital costs as reported of the big ticket projects. Dart Interconnector 4 billion, Metro North 3 billion. And the design modifications proposed here are designed to reduce these costs. Thus both of those projects are capable of being accommodated within the investment envelope in that time period, and yet leaving 10 billion available for investment in other necessary transport infrastructure in the area. And if we feel we need more money, well, let's go back to the Wide Streets Commission and take a leaf out of their book. It was primarily funded by means of a carbon tax 250 years ago. 1 shilling per tonne on coal imported via Dublin Port. If we look at a 0.5 euro per litre additional duty on petrol and diesel through Dublin, it would yield 125 million per annum, or 2.5 billion in the period. So effectively, we are suggesting that the investments are affordable. What we need to do is plan. We need clear and transparent criteria for ranking projects. Develop multi-period plans based on realistic funding envelopes. And these can be moved up or down if the 2% growth is faster, or if the growth is faster than 2%, they can be accelerated. If the growth is slower than 2%, then clearly the programme slows. But you need to have a clear overall vision of where you're going. And we think adopting this type of approach delivers that type of vision. Sure.
So we'll open the floor for questions. We'd ask people to state your name and affiliation or organisation before asking the question. So if you could speak into the microphone.
Good evening and thank you, Gerry. My name's Gerald Beasley from the Railway Safety Commission. I'm probably old enough and perhaps sanguine enough, I hope not caustic enough, to say that I've worked with railways for a long, long time, and I've been involved with many schemes under the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and other funding agencies. I've seen proposals and schemes, and this ranks with them, but many of those schemes have never been delivered. And I think what I miss in this presentation tonight is some sort of economic analysis, some look at the likely OD patterns of travel, the potential flow volumes on the various corridors that you're proposing, and some estimate of cost benefit for the investment. But more critically, what I worry about is that in concentrating on the GDA, we may be forgetting that we have an existing rail transport network throughout the island that has to be maintained at a safe and efficient level going on. And similarly, we have a motorway network that has to be maintained. Ireland is, by international standards, a small economy, and even on the growth figures that you're saying, the sort of funding requirements to maintain and operate existing infrastructures and transport services, plus develop, invest in these plans, may not be achievable. There are a few other issues then that you mentioned, the South's Dublin port. How would we get containers from there into the rail network? It's not rail connected at the moment. And container flow on the Cork main line, the difference in speeds between freight and passenger, particularly if we electrify the Cork main line and up the speeds of the passenger trains, we get into the congestion problem that they're trying to address in the UK with HS2 for passengers and freeing up other routes for freight. Lewis to Lucan, interesting. I think it has got great potential, but I would certainly see that the RPA and NTA should consider extending that type of concept to Louisa Bridge for interconnection with the Maynooth railway line. Again, I think the systems are complementary. I'm glad to see that on the interconnector, which I refuse to call the DART interconnector because it is the national rail interconnector. It will, in the long term, connect Belfast to Cork with a 25 kV system, and that's the correct choice. It is the norm for Europe. It's TSI compliant. And I suppose the other thing I saw as missing perhaps was a bit more reference to the outer suburban commuter traffic into Dublin. You've got Drogheda on your maps, but we do commute from Portlaoise, Carlow, Kilkenny, even people commuting from Cork. And I think you cannot look particularly at the rail solutions for Dublin without setting them into the context of a vision for rail in the long run and into a vision of the complementary roles of light rail and heavy rail. And in the context of the latter, light rail for Cork may become an option too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to address some of the issues raised there, and they're very genuine. The first thing is, you are absolutely correct that there is continuing investment required in the transport infrastructure outside of the GDA. And that's why we set the 45% as the allocation to the GDA. If you take the figures we're talking about there, 37 billion aggregate, that would leave 20 billion for investment in infrastructure outside, transport infrastructure outside the GDA in that area, in that period, should I say, 2020 to 2040. And I think that is quite an adequate number. In terms of the affordability or the cost-benefit analysis, we're running into a situation in Dublin where either we put in a high-capacity system, or we run into total congestion. I mean, the M50 is becoming a nightmare. So we have to address that issue. And there are, I'm not saying that cost benefits shouldn't be done, clearly they should, and Cormac over there would be very conscious of it. But equally well, you're running into the situation that there is no alternative. And this is a significant issue. So, you know, there we have to look. In terms of the outer commuters, and I take your point totally, if we go down to, let me see, sorry. Sorry. If we go down to here, and you're right in that respect, this graphic is deficient in some regards. Effectively, okay, we've now electrified the railway line to Belfast the whole way, so that end is taken care of. You clearly have traffic coming from beyond Maynooth, etc., down into the South City, and that can be carried with the existing rail network as it now is. What is missing from here, and you're quite right, is it is clearly possible to continue to run services from here through to Houston and around through the Phoenix Park Tunnel down into Docklands Station there or indeed with the reduced volumes down into this area. So effectively, you're taking into account the longer distance commuting capacity, and I totally agree with you, and as I said, this graphic is deficient in that regard. Thank you. Any others?
Thanks, Gerry. Eamon O'Reilly from Dublin Port. First, I'd just like to congratulate you on the extraordinary pulling together of an awful lot of ideas, and certainly the focus on taking cars off the M50 and off the motorway network is completely the right one. But I'd just like to put into context one or two of the suggestions that you've made, and while supporting them, I'm afraid that their contribution will actually be quite limited. For example, if all of the petroleum products were put into pipelines, and I'd love to see that, the total volume last year petroleum through Dublin was 3.6 million tonnes. Our growth overall last year was 2 million tonnes. We're projecting a growth of 1.6 million tonnes this year. So even putting all of the petroleum products into a pipeline is equivalent to the growth in Dublin Port in about 2 years. It's a little bit like the Channel Tunnel, I guess. The Channel Tunnel seemed a great idea. All it actually did was forestall investments in ferries for a period until it started to hit peaks. So I think the message that I would have is that the growth rates of freight are going to be huge through Dublin Port. In the 30 years to 2010, the port's volumes went up on average by 4.7% per annum. I think it's not inconceivable that that growth rate is going to continue. There is a colossal challenge to deal with that freight, and anything that can be done to take cars off the road clearly is going to provide more road capacity for the necessary HGV traffic to service the economy. Unfortunately, on the other side of that, rail actually provides, I think, very little real capacity, and again, we are supporters of rail. We have invested in rail to deal with those sort of prodigious levels of growth. But overall, I think the direction of your presentation is to be congratulated. We do need big thinking. We need big projects to get an awful lot of people onto public transport. From my point of view, it's to free up space on the road for HGVs, I'm afraid. Thanks, Gerry.
Eamon, I totally agree, but the reality is there is no silver bullet to this problem. So you're talking, instead of a silver bullet, you're talking about a buckshot. You're talking about a whole series of initiatives that have to be taken in parallel to actually come to some sort of a reasonable outturn. So it's not that any one of these solutions, all we're saying is some of those solutions are relatively low cost and can be implemented fairly, and therefore we should be doing whatever we can. Now, sorry, just one other point. I take your point in relation to the South Docks, that the Lolo terminal there is not rail connected, but part of the benefit of clearing the oil storage facilities on the north side is you create the space available to relocate the Lolo all to the north side, which would have noise benefits as well as everything else. So that's where we're coming from there. Okay? Any other?
There's a question on at the front there. Could we pass down the microphone, please?
Thank you. Brian Richardson from the Irish Maritime Development Office, but really here more in a personal capacity. A number of questions, Gerry. I found that a very good presentation. I liked the idea of the joined-up thinking. I suppose the first question is, where are you with the political powers that be? That would be one question. How far has this overall concept been sold to the powers that be? That would be first question for you. Second one is, you made no reference, and I take Eamon's point, you made no reference in your rail connections there about the requirements. Would the requirement for rail freight out to Keishog, would that have any impact on the passenger traffic? A third question for you would be, do you envisage electrification to Cork, and do you foresee through running of the enterprise from Belfast to Cork?
I could throw a few more at you. You talk about a pre-metro coming from Sandyford, a place which I know well because I travel on the Lewis every day, or not every day, but frequently into the city. If we can have double unit trams travelling down the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich, I don't see why it can't be done to have linked tram units going through Dublin City. It just strikes me that the Swiss can do it and other people do it. I think we should be able to do it. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, just a few of those points, and I won't say I remember all of them. Starting at the last one, clearly there is no technical reason for not having double tram units coming, but the issue is what impact they will have on the remainder of city traffic, particularly if you take the new bridge we're talking about. If the 40-metre tram manages to block some of the road on each side. The bridge, unfortunately, is less than 40 metres. If you make it 80 metres, you're totally blocking the roads north and south. So, you know, you can do that where you have existing road capacity in other areas. In Dublin, we do not have that capacity. Now, in relation to electrification from Houston onwards, we would see a good case to be made for electrifying is the next phase as far as Portlaoise, to the rail maintenance facility there. And again, that would fit in very well. There is a difficulty of electrifying the network other than the Dublin-Belfast network. Because that runs close to the sea, there are actually not that many road crossings on it. And those have been raised. If you go into the rest of the country, Ireland has more road per capita than any country in Europe or the world by a very long chalk. There are an awful lot of bridges to be raised between Portlaoise and Cork. And equally well, the traffic is kind of splitting out. You're going to Galway, you're going to Limerick, you're going, you know, it's not as easy or as obvious as Belfast. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing it, but I don't see it happening. You know, it will happen in stages, and I couldn't envisage when. So was there another element in your question?
No, but I've thought of another one. No. If you go to Brussels, you will find that the relatively recently constructed line between the North Station and the Gare du Midi, 6 tracks wide, takes double-decker trains. I think it was opened after World War II, but somebody might correct me on that. It's 6 tracks wide. It takes double-decker trains. It is saturated. Similarly, there was a line built in Zurich that goes under the Hauptbahnhof, I think, to Enge. It likewise takes double-decker trains. It is saturated. Should we not envisage that the tunnel between Houston, call it DART interconnect or rail interconnect or whatever, surely that tunnel should be built wide enough to take double-decker trains at some future stage, referring back to your lesson of the M50. That's my last one.
The loading gauge on continental railways is much more significant than the loading gauge in Britain or Ireland. Our train here, our track width is wider than Britain, but our loading gauge is the same. In continental Europe, it was designed differently, so they have a lot more space. So effectively, you would have to do an awful lot of work, and frankly, I don't see it as being the appropriate solution. Equally well, if you take, say, as you increase tunnel boring side, or the bore of the tunnel, you increase the cost significantly. The bore of the tunnel envisaged here is an 8-metre bore, that's before you line it. The port access tunnel was 12 metres before it was lined. And what that means is here we're talking about a tunnel where the excavation per metre of length is only 35% of what was required in the port access tunnel. Equally well, the volume of material to be removed is 35%, and the amount of disturbance to people overhead is related to the power of the machine, and that's 35%. So there are significant advantages in staying where it is. Vincent.
Gerry, it's a fascinating paper, really. What I was wondering is, I'm fascinated by the 25 kilovolt AC projection that you have for the future. Would you envisage using electric locomotives on a push-pull basis rather than rail cars on that system?
No, effectively, I think and certainly if you take the experience, and it was fairly controversial within Ireland Ireland at the time, when what's called the Mark IV fleet was bought, there was an argument, fairly well heated argument at board level, between the executive and the non-executives, that it should be intercity railcar types to give you the flexibility of changing the capacity to match the hour of the day. The executive won, and we got the Mark IVs. All I would say is they're now lightly used, and the intercity rail cars with a highly flexible configuration are in fact the preferred solution. So I'm quite certain the people in Northern Ireland envisage, rail cars rather than loco hauled. And also it's easier in terms of the loco is a higher maintenance element in terms of the actual permanent way because of its weight.
Can I just come back in on that last point? I think some people get confused between the business of multiple unit working with electric stock as opposed to multiple unit working with diesel stock. The southern region of British Rail was a very successful progenitor of electric multiple units in 4s, 8s and 12s and so on. When we get to diesel rail cars, the fixed formation sometimes doesn't work, and we lost the corporate memory that we bought rail cars in the 50s with closed ends, and we then had to put gangways on them to get interconnectivity in the train. We've already gone from the 3s and 6s to 4s, 5s and 6s with the formation. I think the kind of operation with 25 kV would be something like the UK Class 395 Javelins, which can run up to 140 miles an hour, by the way. But that sort of thing for the intercity services, something with a 90 mile an hour, 145 kilometre an hour capacity for the outer suburban, and then the inner suburban being 100 kilometre an hour. I just want to also, on the Cork Main Line issue, point out that the bridges are cleared for the high cube containers, so what you said about the Belfast line applies to the Cork line. And the first level crossing on the southern line is at Grange, and the only really congested areas between Limerick Junction and Charleville, where there's quite a number of crossings. But in the cost of a scheme to electrify the Cork line, the cost of eliminating the level crossings by grade separation would be a very small component. So in fact, the Cork Main Line has great potential for electrification, and if you went to Cork Kent with the 25 kV, you go through to Cove and Middleton as well and solve their problems down in Cork. Thank you.
Any other?
Liam Logan, Railway Safety Commission. You identified one of the weaknesses at the start of your presentation of how disparate the current system in the GDA is at the moment.
Yep.
How would you propose the 2040 plan is delivered in an integrated fashion? How would it be operated? What kind of model would you see that's useful to operate that system? How would it be integrated? So you have a north-south metro, you have tram lines, you have a 25 kV tunnel running through the city.
Well, I think in terms of, I think there are two elements. The actual separation of this system from this system actually eases the operational problems in the city quite significantly, because you now have two segregated lines which are not crossing, they're grade separated, and that is giving you a significant amount of operational flexibility which you don't have at the moment. Now, in terms of how you integrate the interchanges there, that's just a question. I mean, the NTA obviously tend to address these issues in terms of trying to force operators who don't necessarily want to integrate their systems to integrating them. And the way you do that is by money. Effectively, you say you don't get the money if you don't deliver the integration. And that is very effective. in terms of thing. And that's why we've seen, you know, the very prolonged fight in relation to having integrated ticketing, etc., resolved when somebody was in a position to say you don't get the money if you don't perform. So part of it is, you know, literally operational. More of it is just how you drive it. But there's no point in having a transport system which is not integrated. And as I said, the integration with the bus network is just as important. And again, I think the pocketbook is the way you keep children under control. And it's the same here.
Yes, Gerry. Liam O'Cleary from the Energy and Environmental Division of the institution. Congratulations on a wonderful, expansive presentation. Really, I think it's given us a lot to think about. As you'd expect, I have a number of areas I would disagree with you on, but I'm not going to raise them tonight because I don't think at this level where you're talking about something at such a high level, my objections would be rather pedantic, actually. I do have a query for you, though. When you said when you proposed the idea of having a single oil terminal at the oil depot on the South Docks at Poolbeg, and then piping it out to into the Midland somewhere, and you compare that with Whitegate.
I think you're demonstrating the fact that you're a dub.
Absolutely. Anywhere outside the two canals is the Midlands, as far as I'm concerned. Never mind the M50. But when the road loading was put in Whitegate, when you were compatible with Whitegate, it was owned by the state at that time. Whitegate was owned by the state when the road loading was put in, and it was, and since then it's passed on to a single operator. So you had a single operator in Tosco, ConocoPhillips, and now Phillips 66. How would you propose to bring the oil companies together to get them to agree to operate a single oil terminal when they all schedule their ship? There is a certain amount of cooperation at the moment, but in many cases, and I have first-hand experience of this, they won't even sit down together in the same room without bringing their lawyers in and so on and claiming antitrust legislation or quoting antitrust legislation in the United States. How would you overcome that problem?
Well, in fact, the person sitting next to you can probably give you a better idea of the answer to that. But
I'm asking you of you.
Okay. Put it this way. If you look, as I said, one of the problems at the moment, as you're very familiar with from the studies you've done from the department, is that the oil tanks in the Northport area are operating at close to bottoms. And effectively, we don't have strategic storage. Now, if you're looking at, we go to pictures. If we're looking at, you say, how can you have a single operator? The most obvious way and the most analogous system to Whitegate is effectively if Nora is involved in some form there as a potential stockholder, certainly, and that you were then, you know, drawing off from a fairly well-maintained storage level on a commercial basis. Now, it may be, obviously there's an accounting issue as to who puts what in, how takes it out, but effectively you have the potential to take in 30,000 tonne vessels there. Now, an awful lot of the operators now in Dublin, because big oil has moved out of this area, can't actually afford the working capital associated with a 30,000 tonne vessel. So we need to have a look at the model. But I mean, the point is, John Fingleton is here, and John obviously has been thinking about this. Effectively, a number of people are looking at this seriously, and obviously they have, okay, well, John's pipe at the moment is shown as coming from the Northport area where you have a common pipeline system. I think you can envisage a way of operating this, which the advantage to the oil companies is the potential to reduce their working capital. And effectively, you know, most of them are strapped for money. So even Dennis O'Brien. So I think we do need to look at that. But I mean, the questions you raise are material. But I think in terms of securing our energy supplies, and Dublin is critical in that respect, I think we need to drive it on the basis that this is a strategic facility. It needs to be operated in a manner which ensures the security of our supply. Now, how do we do that? And I think, notwithstanding the issues you raise, I think there are potential solutions. Okay.
Last question over
Tim.
there. rough stab at what the modal shift would be achieved by each of the phased developments of the integrated rail network? I can't remember.
Well, put it this way, I mean, you're starting from a position at the moment, if you take a CSO study that was released in the last 2 or 3 days, that even within the Dublin area, 70% of the traffic at the moment is carried by private cars. And, you know, that is a serious, and I mean, that's a much higher figure than would be true in comparable cities across continental Europe. We're also saying, as we said, we have an acute congestion problem coming up, and there is no short-term solution. So effectively, I mean, there is 2 things. The NRA are seeking, obviously, as you well know, to impose tolling on the M50, multi-point tolling on the M50 as a way of congestion managing. But the problem with that in political terms is that people justifiably say at the moment there are no alternatives. And, you know, what am I to do? So to introduce that type of congestion management forces people onto other modes, you actually have to provide other modes. Now, in terms of the actual modal splits or detailed cost-benefit analysis, etc., you more than any of the rest of us know the extensive financial resources available to the Academy for engaging consultants in this area. And effectively, what we're saying here is and this is coming back to a question that you raised about political buy-in. What we're doing is raising questions and suggesting possible solutions. We're not saying that, you know, what we've exactly put down here is the 10 Commandments be taken down, and, you know, what we're saying is this is an approach to solving our problems, and you do the normal cost-benefit analysis and other things associated with large ticket investments. You do the question, I mean, we have looked in the analysis at the traffic utilization, etc. And based on the analysis done, if I go down here, this network and the southern extension will give you at least 30% more traffic than was predicted in Metro North. Now, effectively, the figures and the cost-benefit analysis in relation to Metro North weren't made available on the basis that they were commercially sensitive. Having said that, all I can say is if you're getting 30% more and if you've reduced the budget, you have a better return. So if one was acceptable, the other should be. So that's where we are, Tim.
What's Enda Kenny think of it all?
Enda Kenny, it's not in Mayo. So effectively, I mean, this was the Academy's response to a request for submissions by the National Transport Authority, which was made, you know, last month. We are at the early days, obviously, of communicating this process, and there is a long communication process involved. But what we're seeking to do at this level is to see that there is a reasonable technical buy-in to the solutions being put forward, and that, you know, any obvious stupid things are not there, so that when it comes to the political, at least you can say there is acceptance within the engineering and transport professions that these solutions look among the better options available, and you work on from there in terms of political buy-in. Okay?